So as my 3D printer collection continues to grow, I've decided to use Raspberry Pis loaded with Octoprint in order to control and monitor my 3D printers. Now, each of those Raspberry Pis is going to need a case, and I found a really awesome case from 219 Design, and I found it on GrabCAD. Now, these guys made a really great case, like I said, but it was missing a few features that I thought would be really handy for controlling and monitoring the 3D printers that I have. And so I've gone ahead and made those design changes, and I want to take you guys through those design changes and how to assemble the case with the new design changes that I've made so that you guys can have an awesome Raspberry Pi Model 4B case meant for Octoprint to use on your 3D printers.
And so looking at the 3D model, there are some obvious design changes, most notably the Raspberry Pi camera mount on the front, as well as the different hole in the front for a 40mm fan versus the original case's 30mm fan, along with the fan duct that I put on the front of the case. There's a hook on the top there that we'll get to later on for the pegboard. Inside of the case, not much has changed. I changed a few small things that allowed the entire case to be 3D printed more easily. The original design had some small features that were difficult to print, but I really won't get into those small details in this video. Now, there is another version of this case that does not accommodate a Raspberry Pi camera, and so you can see here there's a different fan shroud on the front. The 40mm fan is still inside, and on the right hand side you can see a few more holes there for better air ventilation or circulation because of the larger fan. And the reason I went with a larger fan is because 40mm fans are pretty common to 3D printers, and I figured you guys might have one laying around. Now, taking a look at the 3D printed parts, I just want to point out one of the original features from the 219 Design that I really liked about this thing. So it has, of course, two parts. There's the case and the lid. And when you put the lid on, the lid is reversible 180 degrees. So if you put it on in the first orientation and you snap the lid shut, you'll see that it doesn't quite fully shut. There's some gaps left in there, and these are meant for wires to pass through. So if you are using this case for your 3D printer and you do need to access some of the GPIO pins from the Raspberry Pi for different features that you set up, you can still run wires easily out of the case. Now, you saw that I flipped the case over 180 degrees, and you'll see that it also shuts and snaps shut in a flush mount configuration. So this feature from the original design was, I thought, very clever from 219 Designs, so I kept that. So now we'll just take a quick look at the two lid configurations. So on the left hand side you have the one without the Raspberry Pi camera mount, and on the right hand side you have the one with the Raspberry Pi camera mount. And you'll notice that the camera mount gets in the way of the fan duct. So the duct is actually a partial circle on the one with the camera mount, and on the one without the camera mount, it is a full circular fan duct. And so I'll show you those two parts. Both parts, of course, are also 3D printed. They're screwed in from the bottom, and you are not required to use a 40mm fan with its design. If you want to just run it without a fan, you can do that as well using some short number 4 plastic tapping screws. And you can see there I have panhead plastic tapping screws, and they're screwed in from the bottom to hide the screw heads. And if you are running a 10mm thick 40mm fan, then you're going to want to opt for some longer hardware. These are 3/4 inch long number 4 plastic tapping screws. The shorter ones were only 1/4 inch long, and these ones will pass right through the lid and secure themselves into either the Raspberry Pi camera mount or the fan duct. Taking a look at the Raspberry Pi Model 4B, you can see that I have the camera mounted to the board. And if you're familiar with these camera modules, you'll notice that this is an older version. This is version 1.3. The only reason that I'm using that in this video is because I had one laying around unused in a drawer. If you have the newer 2.1 model, don't worry. It still works with these design files. So the only different piece that you're going to need is the camera mounting face. And so the face plate is different between the version 1.3 and 2.1, but I designed two different versions. So you'll just print the one that you'll need for the camera model that you're using. One other detail worth mentioning here is that space is pretty limited inside this case, and that 40mm fan sits pretty close to the board. Now, one of the mounting screws will also sit very close to a couple of those pins. They are the power over Ethernet pins. And in order to prevent them from shorting, if you have a fan that does not have recessed mounting holes like the one on the right hand side. The one on the left hand side you'll see has recessed holes where the screw heads will fit inside, and there's no chance of those screw heads shorting on any of the pins. But again, if you have the one on the right hand side, then you may need to make a small modification to your Raspberry Pi board. And so the slight modification would be trimming down those power over Ethernet pins. And so I have no use for those pins for this particular project. And so I just took a pair of side cutters and trimmed them down maybe about 2 millimeters or so. Now I did leave enough that if I do, for whatever reason, ever want to use those connections in the future, they should still work. But it's just enough to provide that extra little bit of clearance to prevent shorting on the screw head. Getting the Raspberry Pi into the case is pretty straightforward, but there are a few small details worth mentioning. So on the GPIO pin side, it's a little bit difficult to see, but there are snap features. So you don't have to use hardware to secure the Pi inside of this case. It can simply snap into the case. So you can take the audio video output side of the Raspberry Pi, insert it first, gently sort of just wiggle the Raspberry Pi around until it starts to seat, and then gently press on the GPIO pin side to snap the board into place. Now, one other cool feature here is that the SD card can stay into place while you do this, so there is room for that, and you don't have to worry about damaging it. And looking at the front side of the case with the USB ports, one other design change that I made was adding that notch to allow for the ribbon cable to pass through. So even if you have the lid on in the flush mount position, there is room for the camera ribbon cable to pass through and then loop around up to the camera mount. On the bottom side, even with the hook, there is still access to the SD card. So it's a little bit tight, but you can definitely still get it out and slip it through that open area there. And now I'll grab the lid with the camera mount, and you can see that I've pressed into place an M3 nylon locking nut, and that just, like I said, presses into place pretty firmly, and so that when you go to turn the screw on the other side, you don't have to hold the nut. And I'm going to be installing my fan with the air blowing down onto the Raspberry Pi. So it's going to be drawing air through the fan duct and then pushing it onto the Raspberry Pi. As I've read somewhere, this is more efficient, but who knows. So this is the orientation I'm going with. Again, these are 3/4 inch long, number 4 plastic tapping screws. Grabbing power from your Raspberry Pi board in order to power your fan is really straightforward and simple. Now I've just removed the board here so you can see it a little bit better. You can definitely plug the fan in place with the board inside of your case. But looking at the Raspberry Pi GPIO pins, the very first row here is where you'll find power. So the first 2 pins coming in are 5 volts. So it goes 5 volt, 5 volt, and then the third pin is ground. So if you have a connector like this on your fan, then you're going to want to use pins 2 and 3. Number 2 being power, number 3 being ground. And so it can just plug directly onto the board on that very first row of pins, and the fan will turn on as soon as you turn on your Raspberry Pi board. From here, we can simply just take the lid and press it into place. Make sure that when you're doing this, the ribbon cable for the camera isn't being pinched, and the wires for the fan are not being pinched either, and your lid should sit nice and flush. So now I've got the back mounting plate, the front face plate, and an M3 socket head cap screw that's 20 millimeters long, and we're going to be mounting the Raspberry Pi camera. And so the camera should fit fairly snug into the front face plate, and you'll see, of course, the front lens passes through, and there is a spot for the ribbon cable to pass through on the bottom of the front faceplate, and the front faceplate snaps into the back faceplate. So you're going to line up the front and the back, and it should be a nice either snap or tight interference fit between the 2 pieces, so there's no hardware required. And once you do that, you can take the 2 holes on the back, they line up with the 2 bosses on the camera mount, and that again should be a fairly firm fit. Line those up, and the hole on the inside will line up and allow you to pass through that 20 millimeter long M3 socket head cap screw. Get your hex wrench and just start turning that into place. Eventually it's going to get tight enough that it's going to lock the camera into whatever position it's currently in. And so if you need to back that off and loosen it up, you can, so you can adjust the position and aiming of your camera. Now I'm sure you guys can think of many different creative ways to position or mount your case for whatever application you're using it for. In my case, I have a pegboard, and so I created this hook on the back specifically made for these pegboard hooks. Now of course you can just put it through the front like this, but if it is hanging on the wall, it's gonna sort of sit away from the wall and want to sort of hang there down in a weird sort of position. And one thing that I thought might be a better solution is to actually hook the case in from the back side of the hook and twist it around, so now it sits completely flat against the pegboard wall. And so when you'll see later on when I have it against the wall, it's not hanging there awkwardly. It actually sits quite nicely against the wall and in place securely. And here it is in place in front of my 3D printer on the pegboard wall with the power connection and USB connection to the printer in place. And you can see how nicely it just sits there, and it's very conveniently mounted in such a way that the camera points directly at the printer, so I can see what's going on and check up on my prints using the Raspberry Pi camera and Octoprint. Speaking of which, this is the Octoprint interface, and you can access the camera view simply by clicking on the Control tab, and you will of course now see your 3D printer that you've directed your camera towards.
So that concludes this build and this video. I want to remind you guys that all of the design files can be found in the video description down below. There's a link to those, as well as things like hardware lists so that you guys can complete the project just like I did. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please put them in the comment section down below. I try and get back to everybody. Thanks for watching.